And this is our friend Hattie, who is going to talk to us about her very interesting even continuation of her life within the life as a doctor. And whenever you're ready, Hattie, it's all yours.
Well, welcome everybody. I have invited a couple of friends who may or may not join us later, so please be on the alert if there's a waiting room to let them in.
No, there isn't.
Okay, that's fine then. So I called it Becoming a Serious GP. Well, I don't think I've got time today to take you through being a GP, but from a certain point to a certain point, I'll take you. This is the third talk. And since they're all being recorded, you can ask for the link to listen to them in the future, which is great, I think. Anyway, my sort of subtitle is Careers Are Built on Bricks of Various Experiences. So the last talk I gave you took us up to being a registrar at East Birmingham Hospital. That is now known as Heartlands in East Birmingham. And I was 3 years post-qualification. I had done seven different jobs, each of 6 months duration and different topics in hospitals. And I seriously wanted to become a rheumatologist. I enjoyed the ongoing contact with patients so that you got to know them. And when I was a medical student at King's College Hospital, I was even invited by the rheumatology consultant to go to a patient's house with him. Consultants going to a house? Anyway, I took advantage and I really enjoyed the experience of trying to think through the problems for this patient. How was he going to get a wheelchair through that door and access the cupboards and all the rest of that kind of thing that one had to think about. I love problem solving and DIY, which it wasn't really, but it felt like it. Anyway, bearing that in mind, when I became a registrar in renal medicine, it was kind of second best, because at least you had follow-up with the patients, because they were, here's Nina coming to join me and listening, because at least you had ongoing contact with patients who were had kidney failure, so they were on dialysis of one kind or another, or they were attending outpatients until such time as dialysis was needed. So I became a registrar in the renal unit and overseeing the medical units for the consultants as well. There were the team consisted of 2 consultants and me as the registrar. There was no senior registrar, and 2 senior house officers, one who mainly did the renal unit and one who mainly did the medical unit. And also in East Birmingham Hospital, thank goodness, my saviour, Ambika Bali, is an Indian origin doctor who had qualified in India. Then she came to the UK, she qualified here, she did her further qualifications in Royal College of Physicians, and we had met in Salford, and both luckily managed to get registrar posts in East Birmingham so we could continue to support each other. She wanted to do ophthalmology, and honestly, when she was in the operating theatre, there was conversation, mostly women and cars, by men, but she was told seriously that women can't be ophthalmologists. And she was a bit pissed off with that, I would say the least. But we carried on studying for our membership of the Royal College of Physicians and supported each other. So, GPs of interest in my life. First of all, when I was a kid, our local GP was also a family friend, Roger Dixie in Streatley. So we went to his, well, the back end of his house was the GP's surgery, if you see what I mean, because it was cottage industry at that time. And I often had ear infections, so he attended to those. He also did home visits when necessary, so I had my ears syringed at home. He was very professional. And so he was a friend and also a doctor, and that seemed possible. Then when I got interested in doing medicine, I said to Mum, I think I could go and meet the local GP, couldn't I? So she introduced me to the local GP in our town, and he invited me round for drinks. Well, I was teenage, I dressed up, and I went round to his house for drinks, whatever drinks were, I didn't know. Anyway, he offered me a sherry, and I'd never had alcohol in my life. I wasn't interested. Yeah. And he kind of draped himself over the mantelpiece and leaned on it, and he said, women should not be general practitioners. They shouldn't be doctors. So that meeting was rather short, and I came home and I told Mum, and she said, oh, well, there we go. Don't believe that. So that was my intro, sherry and a no-no. And then during my gap year between school and university, somehow I got to hear of the Peckham Health Experiment, and I went down the library to ask for a book. Well, I had to order it from Leamington Spa, the kind of British Library's dungeon where they had to dig it out. And this was, I've looked it up. I looked it up on Wikipedia to revise. 1926 it started with a couple of doctors in their house, and it was an experiment in the sense that they wanted to study people in the same way as like natural history, so that they would find out what was driving illness. And 3 years later they publicised their information in 1929 and managed to get funding for a purpose-built building in Peckham. And that was opened in 1935, very modern, lots of glass, and very modern thinking too, because their philosophy was that, you know, social life and health all interacted. And so the purpose built was, central to it was a swimming pool, fantastic glass, you know, like an upside down V, glass roof, and also the doctors and nurses could observe people there to see how they were getting on. A ballroom, a gym, dentists, midwives, health visitors, physios, GPs, yes, nurses, yes, and the whole caboodle. And they marketed it with 950 local families signed up for £1 a week, and in today's money that's over a £5 every week. Now that wasn't much, because if you think that before 1948 1948 we did not have the NHS, so people were funding their own health care, and it was a concern to people that people's health was poor, and that's why they chose Peckham, really, because they felt there was quite a cross section of population there. And so a well-known architect designed this building, Sir Owen Williams. Never heard of him myself, but there we go. And they also had cork floors. You remember cork floors? Well, that meant that people could walk barefoot because it was warm and it was comfortable. Anyhow, that worked, and they proved plenty of studies were undertaken. And then World War II, unfortunately, the property got damaged and it was withdrawn from service, really. But members themselves re-established the Peckham Health Centre because they loved it so much and they thought it was such a grand idea. And so after the war, it was actually reopened again, and even after the NHS. But unfortunately, of course, NHS was for everybody, and it kind of undermined the business. But it was very influential in thinking about general practice, and it closed in the end in 1950. Taken over by Southwark Council, and they of course made it into a leisure centre and all sorts of community facilities. And of course you can imagine that the philosophy of the doctors who ran it, well, they had trustees as well, it was all organic food, and they supported the Soil Association, and even today the Pioneer Health Foundation still exists and runs an annual essay competition, because they believe in the principles that, in fact, you know, social circumstances, your home life, individual motivation and health are all linked. So I was really pleased to read that this morning. then when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, we had Medicine in Society, and I really liked that little group. It was quite new, and we got speakers in during term time. So I should think we had about, I don't know, 15 to 18 speakers a year of all sorts, including about China, Cuba. A surgeon spoke from the local hospital, and everybody wanted to go and see him operate. You know, hospital was what we thought we were training for, because that was what's spoken about. But I really did like to learn about other health systems. Médecins Sans Frontières we heard of. And one day in Cambridge you're allowed to go to other lectures as well. And I heard of an anthropology lecture. I thought, well, off I go. And I've never forgotten it, but it's the only one I ever went to. And it was about language in a certain tribal area. And the language was so similar for the activities of lying down, of being ill, and of dying. And the word was so similar in their language. In our language, it's 3 different concepts, 3 different words, 3 different roots. And I thought that was really interesting, that their culture, was it the culture that led to the words, or the words that led to the culture, of viewing lying down as quite dangerous. You know, you could get ill or you could be dying. So they didn't like that. So I thought that was interesting, and I bore that in mind. And then that was the undergraduate time. And in Cambridge you can intercalate. So I did 2 years of undergraduate medical stuff, biochemistry, physiology, anatomy. Oh, lo and behold, there were half a dozen lectures on psychology, which were after the exams. So how many people went? A handful. Anyway, I did, because I was curious. And they were fantastic lectures, and I'm sure they influenced me forever. So when I got to London, I was at King's College Hospital. Why did I choose it? Well, one of the influential things was there was a park next to it. And I knew in my heart that I needed some kind of green space. And of course, now we know that it's essential. So we actually had factored into the course at King's College Hospital about general practice. A chap called John McEwen. And I looked him up this morning. I couldn't find yesterday, but I did today. 1967 to 1993, he worked at King's College Hospital. And again, super influential, very gentle man. He was interested in family planning, reproduction, women's health, community family planning training, and training in general practice for the undergraduates. And he introduced us to all sorts of things about general practice and arranged real practical experience. So I had a practical experience allocated to me. He set up GP visiting whenever I and the local GP could arrange it. So I went to meet Sol Goldenberg in the back streets of Brixton. And his general practice was in the basement at the back of the building, and the building was a red brick. Perhaps it was Peabody, but you know, the design with Georgian proportion windows and lovely red brick. And I just went there whenever I could, and I sat and observed what a GP does. And he was great to his patients. He was patient with me. We had some laughs when I didn't know stuff. And of course, there was a gap when I couldn't go because the medicine training and going abroad and things for my elective period. And when I went back towards the end of my second year, early in my third year, I went back and observed, and he was the only person who gave me any positive feedback as a medical student. He said, "My goodness, you know a lot more." That was enough to boost me. He was sweet. And then the other thing was, perhaps we had to, I don't know, because they realised actually that a high percentage of us were not going to be in hospital. You know, we were going to be general practitioners, so we'd better know about it. And I spent a couple of weeks on a GP attachment over in Suffolk, in Aldeburgh, in fact. And it turned out to be, I mean, I think I probably chose to go with Dr. Ian Tait, T-A-I-T. And I'd heard of his name in terms of medical education for general practitioners. And the practice in Aldborough were just marvellous. They lent us a little flat. There were 2 students from King's who went. They lent us a little flat and lent us a car. I mean, what generosity. And around we went and enjoyed ourselves, but we also learned a lot because he was a super teacher, and we sat in and watched him consult, and he taught us. He really developed general practice. So he gave us this idea of SOAP. Well, we know SOAP's good for COVID. No, I mean, you wrote down your notes: subjective, objective, assessment, plan. Very easy. How to think in a consultation, what to cover. Make sure you've covered the subjective, in other words, listening to what the person is saying about themselves and about their condition. Objective, what you think it might possibly be. No, that's assessment. Objective, your findings, if you examined them or you asked extra questions. A is the assessment, so you then assessed, well, it's most likely to be this, but it could be that or that. And so along those lines, you do your investigations. So that was the plan. Investigations might be weigh today, weigh in a week's time, or it might be a blood test, or it might be see nurse or whatever. So you would have a structure, and there he was teaching structure in our thinking. And I don't think we'd really had that as undergraduate students in all sorts of different departments for a little blocks of time in the hospital. So that was very helpful. We did rather blot our copybooks. A friend came up from London to pick us up at the end of our attachment, and he was fed up of waiting, and I wanted to leave the flat in a good condition, and I was doing the last lot of washing up. You've already done the washing up. And somebody lifted me away from the washing up sink and into the car and home. And so the place was left half finished, half cleaned, and we had a lot to apologise for. So these things do happen, and if I'm on the receiving end of such behaviour, I have a bit more understanding where somebody might be coming from. Another thing that happened was the King's College Hospital is opposite to the Maudsley Hospital in psychiatry, so we had some very good psychiatric teaching. And I remember one particular session with a professor of psychiatry, and there were, can you believe this, one patient who had given his consent, and this was his first interview with the consultant. He'd obviously seen the junior staff, and there were 17 medical students in a quiet circle around that consultation, and within seconds that patient didn't know we were there. The psychiatrist and the patient developed something between them, rapport, and the psychiatrist listened to his concerns and how he'd been sent back from his teaching post in Saudi Arabia because he was so mentally unwell. And there came a question where he said to the patient, "What's the nicest time you can ever remember, you can recall?" And the patient said, "Being in a barber's chair and having a hot shave." And that was the best moment that he could recall in his life. And it was an eye-opener. How the consultant and he got to know each other and got to the nub of how unpleasant his life had been, that could be the most marvellous thing that had ever happened to him. So I was impressed by psychiatry. I thought it was a really good speciality. And then the other thing that happened, in the dining rooms of hospitals, you did often possibly meet GPs because there was a doctor's mess. So it wasn't the whole caboodle of the whole public. And in the doctor's mess, GPs came partly because the lunch was hot and easy to get, but also because they came to education sessions alongside us. So I might sit down for a talk about kidney stones and it would be a GP right next to me. So we'd strike up a wee conversation, and I always found them so human and interested. I liked their company a lot, and I didn't mind sitting down for lunch with them, not just at lectures. And then the other thing I want to tell you is today I went to my bookshelf and I found my old books. So I had been introduced to John Berger, A Fortunate Man, The Story of a Country Doctor. I read that. Lovely. Ivan Illich, Medical Nemesis, An Exploration of Health and How It Could Possibly Be a Political Scene. Richard Asher, Talking Sense, these lovely essays speaking from the patient's experience of different illnesses. So I was introduced to that idea, and the British Medical Journal started having people write articles about their own illnesses. So there was patients' versions of their own illnesses and how they talk to the doctors, and tacked on might be the consultant's version or the GP's version. So you could see one problem from, 3 different points of view. And I never forgot the bit there about thyroid disease, because until thyroxine came out, all patients with underactive thyroid ended up in asylums, mental hospital, because they couldn't function. They didn't have enough thyroid available. Thyroid is a gland in your neck, and the hormone produced by it keeps you warm, active, lively, thinking, the right weight. And he described here the classic symptoms of an underactive thyroid, which is impossible to treat and lands up in a mental hospital. And then he described how thyroxine came about. I think they used extract of pig thyroid gland, and it absolutely revolutionized people's lives. They got up, they started walking, talking, interacting, and leaving hospital. So that was a marvellous little story. And then that's another one about Asher. And then we all had a 4 weeks elective period where majority of us went abroad somewhere. And I went to North America, and there was a link with an Englishman who had become a professor in general practice at Richmond in Virginia. And I'd also, as an undergraduate from Cambridge, I spent a summer holidays away, and that was in South Africa in a mission hospital. And of course the South African experience plus the Cambridge talks, I found out about where there is no doctor. Oh, this is back to front, isn't it? But anyway, so this was my introduction to Médecins Sans Frontières and, being a doctor in other parts of the world. And it was just so exciting that ever after that I had in my mind that that's what I'd like to go and do. However, I didn't. So that was all the background of why I kind of felt at home about GPs. And then let's have a look. Well, at East Birmingham Hospital, I was doing my registrar post, which was 18 months, and I was attached to the dialysis unit. Long-term care again. I like the ongoing care of patients, and a couple of consultants, me and 2 senior house officers. And it was incredibly busy. I had to go and assess people in the emergency unit, the intensive care unit, wherever a bit of kidney thinking was required. So I got friends with other doctors there. And in addition to our little team, we had a GP assistant, and he would come once a week if we needed to do minor surgery, because for dialysis you had to have the artery and the vein in your forearm linked up with a plastic tube embedded. And that tube could then be opened in order to supply blood to the dialysis machine to act like a kidney, do the job of your kidneys. And he would do that mini operation, or the other kind of dialysis, which was through the belly and using the space around the outside of all the guts that space and putting fluid in there, and it would absorb the waste products, and then you emptied it out, and he would embed that plastic tube. So I got to know Chris, and as his assistant, his surgical assistant, which added variety to my week. And bearing in mind that my mum had been on dialysis for about 15 years herself, and I kind of ignored the link, and mum was mum and my work was my work. Anyhow, I did gradually get depressed and low. Various things pissed me off. One time when the two senior house officers wanted to go and do their exams, they both want revision time at the same time. So there's me trying to do the job of 3 doctors. I didn't like it. I did a lot of extra hours, and it was 3 weeks they had off, not just 2, for God's sake. And I could foresee that I would need to do overtime. Now, overtime was frowned on. Yes, it was frowned on. You had to have permission from your consultants for overtime. And I'm glad to say that one consultant did sign the form. At that time, we were paid in units of medical time, which were 4-hour blocks. And so you were expected to work kind of 8 hours a day. So that was called an umpty, units of medical time, an umpty A. That was your full pay. After that, if you had to do extra time like on duty in the hospital, and you had to be in the hospital, that was an umpty B. And that was 30% of basic pay. And if you could go home, but just be on call in case needed, that was 10%. That was an umpty C. And for overtime, you were claiming umpty Bs. So that's what I got when these 2 perishing doctors had been away for 3 weeks. But that really pulled me down. I could see how useless the ward clerk was. She couldn't even file the blood test results properly. I ended up doing it last thing at night after I'd attended to all the people. I attended to the bits of paper. So that annoyed me, and I got very low, and I realised one day as I was pacing around the little office like a little tiger in a cage, I thought, oh, I think I'm suicidal. I better tell somebody. So I went next door to the consultant's office, asked his secretary if I could see him, sat down and said my bit, and he said, yes, I understand that, I've been there too. And him telling me his story was actually very helpful. I felt like somebody did understand, and I realised I had to do something about it, because I actually, that particular week, well, over the weekend I'd been to home, I think, or something. I anyway managed to make contact with Mum, and I was shocked really, because she said, oh, life's got to be better than this, and she was really suffering from pain, and she'd lost height with osteoporosis due to her kidney problems, and she was in pain a lot of the time. And when she said that to me, I just knew that, the end was in sight really for her. So, and I could not face seeing patients who were very ill, and I had to ask other doctors to do that bit. I couldn't do it. So I phoned up a clinical psychologist who I had invited to come to the renal unit and give a talk to the staff about the kind of pressures working in a long-term care situation with serious illness. And she was marvellous, and I phoned her up on Monday in my little lunch break, and asked her if I could possibly see her. Yes, she says, I'll see you at Friday in my lunch break. So I beetled off and I saw her and explained. And I knew that her lunch break being an hour and me getting there and all the rest of it. Anyway, so it was about half an hour appointment. By the end of that time, she had helped. The word was pre-bereavement grief. Ooh, I said, fine. Okay, that vibes. Thank you. I'll go away and look it up and read about it and understand it more. And I did. And I went back 2 weeks later to see her, and I said, thank you. And she started telling me her problems. So So we had a really good little ding dong, and I just felt so much lighter and more understood. And seriously, the following week I could function. I could go and see other ill patients. They weren't my mother any longer. You know, my grief was mine. I knew what it was about then. So that was really a time when I had to rethink what's going on, and I realised that my dream of being an overseas doctor, I thought, well, actually I haven't done anything about it, and I think I'm more a home bird. I need to be home and need to be around for mum, and okay, I give that idea up. Oh, that was such a relief, I can't tell you. It was like a burden off my shoulders when I stopped believing that I was going to go abroad and be a doctor somewhere. So that was a relief. And it also became clear that really there were no rheumatology jobs to be had. The previous few years rheumatology had developed as a speciality, initially as a kind of a general medical consultant with an interest in rheumatology. Well, you know, it had progressed so that there were some full-time posts in rheumatology, but very few, a handful. And I realised as I did my research about how to progress, I realised that there weren't going to be any posts for medium intelligence people like me, and really there were hardly going to be any posts anyway. So I had to think again. And I thought about general practice a bit, but and one night I was talking with Ambika, as we did, and about midnight, you know, it was really time to pack up talking and go and get some sleep. And I'd bought a house of my own, so I was driving home. But before I left, she said, Hat, I expect you to get another job tomorrow. What? You must be kidding. Oh, for good. Oh. Bye. Good night. Anyway, I did. I picked up the BMJ in the morning. That's the British Medical Journal. And at the back, there was all these adverts for different jobs. And I saw there was a GP training post going. And it was with Chris, the guy who did the mini operations with me for the renal unit. God, you know, how did that come about? Just that particular day. I don't suppose it was advertised more than once in the journal. And Ambika pushed the button. I phoned him up before I left the house, and he said, the job's yours. So I gave up hospital stuff. I did do the full 18 months, honest. Yeah, I did. And off I went, becoming a GP. And that's how, you know, you can see all the different blocks and the different bricks and how that went. I'm afraid there's a bit more I must tell you, because the job in the renal unit, it was bloody hard. I've told you the holidays episode and the useless filing, and one day I was, you know, stuck juggling all different things, and I said to Phyllis, the ward clerk, Phyllis, could you just bleep Dr. So-and-so? I really need them here now, please. She had been working there for 17 years. She said, how do I do that? You know, oh dear. Anyway, and the other thing, Birmingham, culture. Nobody said thank you. Nobody just spoke the words, thanks, Doc. They just didn't. I'd had a bracelet given to me by one of the husbands of a patient. And when I actually left, I was given a glass decanter by another patient. But, you know, what really mattered was just the humanity of saying, thanks, Doc. That must have been hard, or, you know, I know that was, you know, something lovely you did, especially for my relative. You know, it was bloody hard work. Anyhow, so I got the job. By transferring into general practice, I had to fulfill certain jobs in certain topics, like you have to have done general medicine, you have to have done medicine for the elderly, you have to have done ear, nose and throat or dermatology, you have to have done paediatrics. So paediatrics was the one that I hadn't done, and when I stopped being a registrar, I went down a grade to senior house officer in paediatrics at Solihull Hospital, so I drove over there every day. And I did the GP training course, which was a half-day release course every week, being trained to be a GP, and I absolutely adored it. I really enjoyed it. And one day the teacher was saying, we'll do a role play. Anybody fancy doing such and such a role as a patient? And I volunteered, because I do. And I was volunteering to act and invent the history and the part of a woman with an alcohol problem and children. Anyhow, at the end of the afternoon, when everyone else had gone home, he said, could he have a chat with me? And he said, is that your personal experience? And I said, no, it's all just invented. But he did wonder. He said it was so convincing. I thought that might be really your personal experience. So, and at the end of the course, I was offered to become a part of a particular medical team in Birmingham, with the offer of a partnership, as we did in those days, and I took a deep breath, and I had learned to say, I'll think about that. Birmingham? Live in Birmingham? Oh no, I don't think I can. So I had to kind of calm all that down, and then when I next saw him, and I said, I think I'll carry on looking a bit further and see what I can find. Which was a bit mean, really. But I did. Once I'd qualified and got my JCPGTPT, whatever it is, Joint Committee on Training in General Practice, something like that. Anyway, once I got my certificate, and I did know I wanted to be a GP, I started looking about, and I guess I had enough money, and I had a house, and I could start doing some locums, and I could look around at different jobs and see what kind of different practices there were, because I'd only had the experience of being a trainee in one practice, and there must be different styles and different beliefs and different ways of relating. So one so-called interview I went to, it was a kind of front room of the house, and the receptionist welcomed me, and she showed me the patient book. So there was the list of all the patients that the GP had seen that morning. He didn't write any notes except on one line in a book, and so I could see what he'd seen. Below diaphragm was BD, above diaphragm was AD, and what he'd prescribed would be indigestion mix for above diaphragm and anti-diarrhea for below diaphragm, that sort of thing. And he had seen 73 people that morning, and I just thought, ugh, I don't want to work there. Other places just couldn't believe that all I wanted was just to come and have a look and sit around and maybe go to a practice meeting and see what it was like in a different practice. No, we haven't got a job. We haven't got a job for you. No, there's no jobs available. I said, no, I'm not looking for a job, honest. I just want to see what different practices can be like. And I went to see one or two, but most often they were refused. I did a locum in Birmingham. Again, it was one of the small streets with terraced housing, beautiful old stuff we think now. But in that time, again, the front room was where the GP worked, and the back room was the kitchen, but now the receptionist sat at the desk with a tiled floor. And I walked down the passageway past the front room to the kitchen, and it was all hard tiles and darkish. And I did a locum. And during that locum, I did take lunch breaks, and I wandered around to have a sniff at the local, fruit and veg and the shops on the streets. And I came back with some carpet samples, which were, I don't know, about a foot wide, top to bottom, and about, 2.5 feet wide, something like that. And I got some gaffer tape, and I stuck them on the floor of that passageway going down to the kitchen. And when the GP came back, he was thrilled. He thought that was lovely. It was, a touch. Well, in his room, there was no curtain to pull round the examination couch, but you did have one of those little curtains on wheels that you manipulated and tripped over to put between you and the patient so that you could examine them and they could get dressed. So that was another experience. And my parents had a GP friend in Norfolk, and he had trained as a mature student to be a GP. And he had a locum available for me, and I'd finished seeing the patients one evening, and I went into his room and I said, "Can I sit in?" And he was a bit shocked, I think, but anyway, I sat down. And so I witnessed him consulting, and he'd never ever had anybody watch him consulting. In all his training, he'd been trained as a GP. Nobody watched him consulting. And that particular consultation was a woman who had several children, and she herself had got the diarrhea and vomiting from the kids, and he advised her to have port. Port, my dear. So that was him, and she was trying to manage with other kids in a back room. I just thought, he's miles away from his patients. He doesn't understand. Didn't give good advice. She hasn't got any port. She's got no money to get any. Anyhow, I just kept me counsel. And then another time I was invited to do a locum in Sheffield. A friend of mine who also trained as a mature student, she had already gone into general practice and partnered up with another chap in Sheffield, in Crooks. And Crooks is quite steep on hills in Sheffield, and they had discovered that there were 3 general practice single-handers who had died off. And the poor patients hadn't had a GP for ages and ages. And these 2 people set up as a new practice. And Kate got burnout, of course. I mean, they even had to go and collect all the patients' paper notes from the family practitioner committee. And they'd had to hire all the staff, arrange all the buildings. They'd had to do everything from scratch. So when she got burnout, I went to help out for a few weeks, and the branch practice that I was in, not the main house, but the branch surgery I was running, was up the clock tower in a church on the hill in Crooks. So actually, if you couldn't get up the stairs, you couldn't come and see me. You definitely would have to be taken to the house where the practice was to be seen. But it was an extraordinary experience, and it really was, whatever your environment, you're still a doctor, and you were still there for the person's concern and to help them. And I, by that time, had begun to discover the sort of practice that I did want, and I started applying, and I've had an exercise book, and I just cut out these little adverts from the British Medical Journal, and I applied for about 30 before I found the one that I wanted to and went to work in. So, sorry for a blah blah non-stop, but ask any questions.
So what was the practice you got into?
Runcorn in Cheshire. I will tell you about that another day.
Yes.
Hattie, right at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned, just before you described the Peckham facility, was it Petland, the name of the you gave us?
Are you meaning Peckham? Peckham?
No, you mentioned something just prior to that. Was it a book or?
Yes, there was a book that I requested from. I requested a book from the library called The Peckham Health Experiment.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I misunderstood you. Yeah.
I think it was the same word, probably.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Most interesting.
I'm so glad to do this talk because I loved going to look up those people and find out their proper names again and things.
I I myself studied in psychiatry, and one of the people who was an enormous influence in my life was a chap called Eric Byrne.
Oh, B-O-N-E?
Yeah.
Burn. B-U-R-N-E.
B-U-R-N-E, yeah.
Oh, yes.
A fascinating person. I learned quite a lot from him.
Luckily, I did my intercalated year in Cambridge. I didn't tell you this, but I did social and political sciences, and I did a paper in attitudes and behaviour and a paper in child psychology or child development. And I'm sure that influenced me an awful lot. Eric Byrne was one of those influential, and Irving Goff. Yeah. So I think I had a bit of priming there. And many people said to me when I was choosing a career, they said, you should become a psychiatrist. And I said, I think there's enough psychiatry in general practice.
So sorry, Graham, I leapt in before you. Do carry on, my friend.
I wanted to ask Hattie how she is using now all the knowledge and experience she has gathered over the years.
Well, I hated retirement. You've made me jump to the end of my career now. A new talk. No, I hated retirement. After a couple of years, I was sitting on the sofa and I thought, Hat, you don't want to be sitting here. Come on. What did you used to enjoy doing? Oh, you loved general practice. Yeah, you loved it. Why don't you be a GP again? And I spent 2015 retraining and I couldn't get back into it because I'd had a head injury. And my tutor said, I'm sorry, there's a couple of reasons that I can't pass you as a GP. When I went to see occupational health, they said, it was the head injury that was preventing me from coming up to scratch, really. Anyway, and so I have had to adapt. And I think I use my medical knowledge to support my friends and people who ask me for tips and advice. And I have never, ever been abused or overused by friends who've asked for medical advice and tips and help. And I give my knowledge and experience freely because I have it, and why not? It's so generous that I was given a grant to go to Cambridge. I was trained. It was a good training, and I want to share it. I had a lovely little comment from a friend of mine. Let's see, a couple of days ago, we went out for late lunch, and there was a sick child on the next table, and clearly grandma could not carry him down the stairs. And I said, I'm sure one of us will help, knowing that I could. And the man on my table said that he couldn't because he didn't trust himself to carry a child. He'd never carried one. And I carried him downstairs. Well, first of all, I introduced myself and found out his name and asked if it was okay if I could carry him down the stairs. And was it okay by Granny? Yes, it was. Okay, so I picked him up and took him downstairs and popped him in the car. And then I got a text from my friend saying that was so touching and generous. But to me, that's kind of a normal. And I did explain to the woman that I had previously been a doctor, and I said, your child is actually ill. And so it transpired she did know what she was doing, and so I left it at that. I didn't give heaps of advice, but she did know what she was doing. And and friends who are negotiating the medical system, God's sake. And we've got doctors who are overtly practicing safety medicine. Oh, I can't make a decision about that. I'll refer you somewhere else. Or we better do this, or we better do that. And I think to myself, come on, people haven't learned to trust themselves. When I was working up that clock tower in Sheffield, there was an elderly lady called for a house visit. She was in her 90s, I think. And she had diarrhea and vomiting. And I popped round and I explained to her what to do, and there was nobody else to help her. So I made up the mixture for her to drink, and I said I'd telephone and see how things was going. Because in those days, by that time, there were fewer people who had to get out to the slot machine telephone. and she had a phone, and yeah, she was doing reasonably well. But I felt the need to go and see her later on in the day, and I think on my fourth visit to see her, which was at the end of my working day, I think I was satisfied I'd kept her out of hospital. That was important. So that's how I help my friends.
Thank you.
It would be a generalisation, but do you fear for today's doctors?
I do.
Yeah.
But in what way, Mary, were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking of a GP practice. I happen to know one well, and the amount of hours and the stress during those hours is almost intolerable.
Yes, I would say somehow you have to be grounded and have your own interests and friendships. And there's a lot of admin. But you know, I think what might also be hitting is this feeling of lack of control, because when I was a GP, I was a partner. And so it was our decisions how to run the practice, whereas now 30% of practices are owned by essentially the United States. And it's a quiet private takeover of the NHS, really, which is very sad. And it often means that you're not a partner, so that means that you're working for somebody, and you can therefore say, no, I'm only paid for 8.5 hours a day, so I'm going home now. And you leave it. But you don't. When you're a partner, you don't. They're your patients. And I found the most difficult thing was changing from a practice where we had our own lists of patients to a practice where everybody could see everybody. You see, you develop a commitment to people. You have a feeling about who you can trust and work with, and some patients you can't work with. You do your best, and you're doing it as a doctor, but some other patients you can listen and understand a bit more about where they're coming from, and empathize and anyway, I mean, I remember one patient sending me a card immediately after the consultation saying all power to your elbow or something like that, you know, because I'd shared a little snippet of my life which was relevant, and she really wanted to say, you know, heartfelt with yous, which was so sweet. Yeah.
Did you say 30% of surgeries are owned by the states?
I believe 30% are owned now. They are not owned by the GPs who work in them.
They're owned by the United States?
The majority of them are owned by American companies, yes.
Jeffrey?
I seem to... is it the case that there was a notable doctor who murdered his patients, Dr. Harold somebody?
Shipman.
Was it only after that doctors were required to be in working numbers together in practices? Previous to that, was it permissible and often the case that a GP just worked alone?
Oh yes, it was very common for GPs to work alone. Yes, it was. You just set up your practice as I described in the kitchen, or no, not in the kitchen. You got the front room. Majority of GPs were working single-handed, and I think it was really important to them to go to the hospitals to attend education and meet other GPs. But Harold Shipman, Harold Shipman worked in a group. He wasn't single-handed.
Oh, goodness.
No, he worked in a group, and the government push to get people to work in groups was financial. It wasn't, well, I suppose it was political as well, but it wasn't post-Shipman action. And we will have other Shipmans, I'm afraid, because being a doctor is quite powerful. You are only in the room with your patient, and you are actually in a powerful position. So I know friends of mine who've been belittled by doctors, but if I go along as a friend, or even in the job centre, you know, job centre interviews are just one-to-one, and I went with a friend of mine to her job centre interview, and she said afterwards it was totally different. having a witness there, having somebody, a third person there. They were so nice to me, and all of the time they have been so awful to me every time. And it's such a powerful situation that I think Shipman was addicted to power.
On the 21st century, we have the amazing rise of technology. How far do you think that will go? Because I remember speaking to a doctor once, and she says that you have patients coming sometimes which are euphemistically nicknamed Dr. Google.
Yes, I mean, I remember a lot of talk when people used to search the internet and come and present you with 20 to 100 pieces of paper all about the topic that they were concerned of. And it really was like, you know, here, doctor, you've got to read this, you've got to listen. And it was a trouble, because I think they were worrying themselves sick as well. And what a doctor can do for you is to sort out the wheat from the chaff. I mean, a doctor has heard quite a lot before, and even though we are allopaths, most of us, not homeopaths and not necessarily very holistic, we do understand that, you know, some symptoms matter more than others, and clusters of symptoms matter. So I remember when I was a medical student in between 74 and 77, I remember about that time algorithms coming out to differentiate an appendix from other abdominal pain. And at King's College Hospital there was a Professor Anderson, and he really thought computers were where they were at, and he managed to persuade the board of King's College Hospital to buy 20 computers, but he didn't manage the doctors on the wards he didn't manage to persuade them to get in love with computers, because they were pretty clunky at that time. So those computers remained in the dungeons in the basement for a long time. But he was a groundbreaking professor, and computers, I remember when, again, computers became more or less obligatory as a GP, and there were heaps of complaints about, you know, the doctors paying more attention to their bloody computer than they are listening to me. And that was correct. And then you got standards, so you had to tick the boxes to get paid, and that was even less personal time. So it's the actual personal touch and listening to where the patient's coming from and trying, you know, there's 3 different versions, aren't there, of what's going on. There's your version from your perspective, there's my version from my perspective, and there's something you might call the truth. But you know, there's always at least 3 perspectives to have on a problem. And in order to get somebody to change, you have to learn about what's called the cycle of change, because, you know, if they don't perceive there's a problem at all, they'll carry on smoking. Smoking was advertised as a great thing in the war. Cigarettes, calm your nerves, you know. So there was a lot of work to be done when Charles Fletcher, the first television doctor, realised how damaging cigarettes were, and, you know, wanted to put it out to the public. Yeah. David?
Yeah, Hattie, thank you so much. There were a few points in there where I felt really touched, like when you were making contact with the psychologist and talking about your suicidal feelings, and obviously getting real empathy and connection there. And I think that's quite important for patients to feel really connected to. And just by the way, when you hold up a book, it looks to you as though it's back to front, but other people see it the right way round. You're actually seeing a mirror. You're seeing a mirror image picture of yourself, and everybody else you're seeing the right way around. That's how. Just so you know. And I've put links to your earlier talks in the chat, and also to all the talks as well, if anybody wants them. So yeah, thank you, Hattie.
So to get them out of the chat, we have to copy and paste them into our computer somewhere.
Yeah, you can, if you go to the bottom of the chat, there's a thing that says, there's a little drop down, ... that says save chat. And it's saved in a folder called Zoom in your documents.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So do I have to create a folder called Zoom in my document?
No, it does it automatically when if you click on Save Chat, it just goes and does it, so you can find it later.
I can't see a save. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. In the chat box where it says type message here, over on the right hand end, it's got a very helpful sign that just goes ... And if you click on ... it says Save Chat. And if you click on Save Chat,
David, hang on a moment. You see the word that says to everyone?
Yeah.
Go over to the right of that, and there's a page and a smiley and 3 dots there, and it's those.
The three dots. If you click on the 3 dots, which means more, and you get a drop down that says Save Chat.
But then I'm going to find it in a folder called Zoom in my own computer.
Yeah, called in a folder called in your documents folder. So if you just look up Zoom, you'll find the chat is saved there.
Really? Well, I'm so glad I played ignorant. Zoom. Zoom-tool.pma or something.
And we will look up how to do closed captioning. I think that would be an interesting innovation.
21.8.21 Zoom chat.
I haven't found it yet, but I've copied and pasted instead. Well,
Yeah,
I've copied, ready.
You can do that too. That means you've got to be creative where you're going to copy it to. I often copy it into a blank email.
Oh yeah, I need a little more education on that, please.
Okay.
Because I can't find it when I'm searching for it in my folder. I cannot find it in my documents. Oh, there's a document folder called Zoom. Let's see what's in there. Zoom links 2020. 10/9/21 Central Friday discussion. Oh, thank you.
Amazing.
All right. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Uncle Lynn.
Ray, I have a general question, please, in relation to the talks. Do we have permission to share them with people other than Quaker friends? Or do we have to get permission from individual contributors?
I can answer that. You don't have to ask permission. What we normally do is the talks are not made public. You can't find them on a search engine, but we circulate the link. They're filed in Zoom as private or something like that, or unlisted, I think. There's 3 versions. There's public, there's private, and there's unlisted. And we keep them as unlisted, which means if you give the link to someone, they've got it and they can pass it on. So it's a sort of informal pass it on link rather than making it public. We've had some discussion about this and we didn't reach a conclusion, but the point is that we save the talks, we share a link. It appears in I think it normally appears in the weekly notices, doesn't it, Jeffrey? Or from time to time it appears. And anyway, and there's a playlist with all the talks. So if you keep a link to that playlist, you can always find the latest talk, because the latest talk will be added to it when it's uploaded.
Brilliant, thank you.
So you can share with anyone you like, and they can share with anyone they like. And one should be aware of the courtesies. And there was one talk where there was some more private information given out. And after some discussion, we simply didn't publish that talk.
I think you've probably touched on the second part of my question was, when we find the talks, can we isolate just one to share? Or by sharing the link, do people get all of the talks in one go?
I'm not sure quite how that works, but
I might experiment, send it to myself. Okay, thanks. And thank you, Hattie.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure, actually.
Very moving. Very moving.
Any more questions, friends? No. Okay, I think we have come to an end, and also thanks to Hattie for another very interesting hour, and we hope it might continue at some further date.
Yes, I would love to do that and share some more little snippets and stories from Runcorn and Bristol.
My hard-working friend who is beside me on the screen, the young Patsy, will no doubt be in contact with you.
I will. And have you got the title for next week there, Ray?
Yeah, the answer to that, sadly, is no, I don't.
I've got it. I've got it. David Saunders is going to be talking to us about community action and climate change.
Oh,